Welcome everyone to investor.net. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the AI investment thesis. And this comes on the back of a tweet that I made a little while ago, which was essentially that I believe AI is a high utility, but perhaps not a high value accrual technology. It goes a little bit into something that some of you might be in a similar situation to me, being offered investment into OpenAI and XAI. And so unfortunately, I'm not offered it directly, so I kind of get some secondary market things. So it's actually more expensive than it would be normally, but we're typically, I think the first round it was offered at for OpenAI was 50 or 60 billion or something. I think it's now around 100 billion. But you get kind of these added fees on top of there because you're investing through some kind of a syndicate or something like that. XAI, I believe, was most recently offered at around 35 billion, something like that. So I was looking at these deals and thinking, like, should I invest, right? I'm going to kind of go through with you today sort of my mental model of it. I would love to hear yours. Put it in the comments below and feel free to join our community. And we've been having some ongoing discussion with people back and forth around what we think here. When I look at those particular areas, and I look at AI broadly, right, you can kind of make this really clear statement that, okay, AI is probably a deeply disruptive technology. It's probably going to change the way we interact with our devices. It's probably going to be really useful in a bunch of regards. That's all well and good for the consumer, but it's not necessarily that good for the investor. This is a very famous talk that was given by Warren Buffett in 1999 at Sun Valley, where he went through, they were talking about the internet and people were, there's all these freshly minted millionaires. They were saying Warren is kind of this stuffed up old school guy who he's kind of lost the trend and this is the way to go. And obviously 1999, pretty close to the peak of the dot-com bubble. He did this presentation where he said, well, surprise, surprise, this is not the first time a disruptive technology has come into the market. And he showed automobiles and aircrafts as the two previous examples. And you might think, hey, listen, if I had only invested in the automobile industry at the start in the early 1900s, I would have done really well, right? But he showed that the aggregate return on invested capital was only like 5% a year compounded. And for airlines anyway, it was actually negative. So he kind of pointed out that you can have this disruptive technology, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you do really well from an investment standpoint. In fact, it turned out the better thing to do than buy automobile companies, which by the way, there were certain ones that you could have done that were great, right? So I think if you'd invested in Ford, you probably would have done well. But there was something like 2,000 US automakers, most of whom went bankrupt. Obviously, there's some consolidation and things like this. And so we're looking at kind of the aggregate return on invested capital. And obviously something sort of similar happened during the dot-coms. Yes, there were some winners. Those winners did great. But the question is, how good were you to be able to pick those winners? Buffett pointed out that the easier thing to do was simply to short horses. That was like the real win that you had rather than trying to go and pick the winning automobile company. When we go and we look at AI, I sort of have this mental model for productivity enhancements in general. And this is that when you have productivity increases, value can accrue to 4 possible places. And by the way, I think this is something that Kathy Wood with ARK Invest gets wrong. And it's one of the reasons why, in spite of the fact that I think they're probably right on the disruptive nature of various of these technologies and the intersection of those technologies, she ends up not doing well on a lot of the particular bets, timing aside, which her timing tends to be pretty bad. What are those? Well, if you have an increase in productivity, which is essentially more input, less output, what you get is you have that accrue to either first the consumer. Okay, great. We think societally at least that is positive. When does that happen? That happens when there's a high degree of competition in the market and it erodes the margins, right? So the value accrual goes to the consumer based on that competition. The second could be shareholders. This is typically when you have some sort of a monopoly, value accrue to shareholders. Could be the employees, right? This is a situation where there's either organized labor or you have really specific skill sets that are very scarce. So we've seen, for example, really high wages paid in Silicon Valley for Google and Facebook and companies like this. And so, hey, listen, if you can be a machine learning engineer and you're earning $2 million a year, great. That technology has been accretive to you. So awesome. Not generally true for most people and most technologies. And the last one is regulatory capture. Okay, so it's possible that regulators can come in and they can suck this up. We've obviously seen that a lot in the pharmaceutical industry, right? So you've got these very high margins, but a lot of the returns end up getting captured across the industry by regulators because it costs $2 billion to take a drug to market and it takes 12 years and this sort of thing, right? So very, very difficult to have the types of returns that you would get in, say, tech, where you don't have that regulator taking this on. With that kind of mental model in mind, The question is like, how does AI play out in this regard? And here, I think, there's going to be so many ways that AI will play out. What I'm thinking about is like, where are the layers of the stack that I can invest? And specifically thinking around things like OpenAI, XAI, right? Basically, all the profit, or the vast majority of the profit, has been made by Nvidia. Maybe you can say like cloud service providers, so Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, you've got some of that stuff, all right? But mainly it's been sucked up by Nvidia. And then there's kind of a tech stack behind that. You have TSMC and ASML and high bandwidth memory, and there's some halo of that. But the main point has been Nvidia up till this point in time. What about these frontier models? You're spending potentially billions of dollars on this, and what are you getting for that? If I look at something like XAI, it's an Elon Musk company, I generally would want to say, nobody's ever made money betting against Elon. It's typically, greatest entrepreneur of our age, probably just betting on him is smart. But I couldn't develop an investment thesis. At $35 billion valuation or whatever, yeah, he stood up this Colossus supercluster in like 18 days or something, when it normally takes a year to do. Very, very impressive from an engineering standpoint. But what am I buying? I'm basically buying 100,000 H100s. What's the value of those H100s over time? They're going to depreciate really fast, right? So it's technology. It's, the H200s are coming out. You're going to have kind of the next round and the next round. So the retention in that regard isn't great. And then they're not actually renting them out or something. What they're doing is they're using them for their own processing. So they're trying to build models on it, which means they're spending money on electricity. That electricity is going to be gone. So the question is, what is shelf life of that model? And I think the shelf life of that model is basically, 6 months or something. Like, it's very, very hard at this stage, some sort of competitive lock-in with this model. It just strikes me as tough. Even if you can build a better model, even if you can get users for that model, et cetera, if that model is overrun 6 months later and you have to redo the training, well then what did you just spend all that money for? It's very, very hard to generate enough cash flow in 6 months from the output of a model, or even 12 months, to justify the training of that model. Normally you have to look for like a long downstream revenue source that's going to pay off for you. And my view is essentially that all these models are probably converging on the same point. That's more or less what we've seen, right? Gemini, Anthropic, Grok, Llama, OpenAI with ChatGPT, like all these different models seem to be converging on more or less the same outputs. So there doesn't seem to me to be any competitive advantage there. That seems like it accrues really well to consumers. It doesn't accrue really well to shareholders. And I need to extract shareholder value in order to make the investment worthwhile, especially at these high valuations. Then I can start thinking to myself, all right, well, if there's not going to be the value in the models, and you've got companies like Meta that are basically scorched earth, just open sourcing it to try and kind of make it difficult for other companies to accrue the subscription value, where can you go? And it is true that at this stage, there has been the notion that OpenAI is growing cash flows at kind of a comparable rate to what Google was doing around the time that Google went public. So that's if you've listened to Brad Gerstner from Altimeter Capital, who is, very sharp investor. Altimeter does phenomenally well, so, it's like worth paying attention to what they're saying. This being said, I think that analog is probably not a very good one. So in general, I think reasoning by analogy is not a great way to go compared to reasoning from first principles. And if I just kind of look at some of where the analog fails, when it comes to Google, they could have pretty easy brand lock-in because their product was zero cost for the consumer, and therefore it was kind of a scorched earth strategy. Whereas if I go and I look at something like OpenAI, the way that they're making money is off 20 or 200 or whatever dollar per month subscriptions. If the value of the model is going to near zero, then I feel like the likely outcome is that competition forces that subscription margin to somewhere just above the cost of the bare metal compute. And we know that's not a very good business. So it might be that more analogous to this than the search business is the cloud storage business, right? So if you look like how much money is being made by Dropbox or by Box.net or by Azure, OneDrive or Google Drive, like these are not really big profit centers. The margins on them are not very good. So yes, Azure makes a lot of money. Yes, Google Cloud makes a lot of money. Yes, AWS makes a lot of money, but not off of these like consumer-facing storage. Usually it's kind of the more complex things. So for example, if you look at Microsoft Azure, they have things like Cosmos DB, right? It's a more complex product. If you're looking at something like Google Cloud, you have Cloud Firestore and Firebase and all the kind of fancy stuff that they do there. Again, you kind of get the kind of platform as a service technologies that tend to be doing better than this other stuff. I'm pretty skeptical that they can have margin retention as they grow and continue to scale up these users. It's possible that they can have some brand lock-in. Clearly right now, they've got about 80% market share. That market share tends to be pretty sticky. They've definitely got kind of top of mind awareness, but what does it take to displace that? It's not really that clear to me that you can hold on to it. And it seems like if they can't continue to continuously produce a better model than the next guys, then at some point people say, well, hang on, why am I paying $20 a month or $200 a month when I can go over here and I can pay $5 a month or $2 a month? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that's sort of my position on OpenAI. I think it's a very risky bet. I think at the present valuations, I don't really see what you're getting that's durable for the money that you're putting in. Similar thing with XAI. And so then you can ask, well, where then in the stack is there going to be value accrual? It's possible that you're going to have something at the application layer that ends up grabbing some sort of value. Obviously, you've got Nvidia, et cetera, which I think is interesting. If you can get into Grok, which is not to be confused with Grok of OpenAI, G-R-O-K, it's G-R-O-Q. It's more advanced inference chips, so maybe there's an argument to play that game that might be interesting. There could be like fancy little things. Another interesting point is that a lot of the times at the application layer, the tool set for how you interact with the outputs is pretty important. So if you think about, for example, the use of AI in Photoshop, the use of AI in game development software. So if you look at kind of Unreal Engine, Unity, et cetera, you can say, on the one hand, they're ripe for disruption because you can build this software stack through AI, right? You essentially replace a bunch of the heuristics with some sort of a neural net. All right, like that's maybe possible, but the key issue is how you build that into a production pipeline for a completed output and how you interact with it actually is quite nuanced. You have to have lots of people working on it. You want to be able to engage with it in the right way. It's not really that clear that natural language on its own is very well suited for this. And so I'm not really very convinced that this is just going to eat those industries and allow you to somehow gather it. I think that there's probably some niche products in there that are going to be required. This is sort of, generally speaking, my thesis on AI. I have not been able to develop a thesis on places to invest aside from, I think, high bandwidth memory, very interesting. SK Hynix is an interesting one. Micron is kind of the other major competitor. Certainly Nvidia has been, the big run up at this point. Clearly the valuations are really high, so it's hard to make any sort of a bet at that stage. There might be some others. There is a competing company out of China that might be interesting to take a look at. SMIC is the name. And so they might be a disruptor in that space. We certainly have some reason to believe that over time there will be competition for ASML's lithography. And so there could be some payoff there. Hard to say. You have to kind of play that around, but it's something that I would certainly pay attention to and think a little bit about what is the value that I can capture. But I also think that the really interesting thing that most people are not talking about is often when you have these disruptive technologies come in, there are some very orthogonal, non-obvious consequences that end up being really good. And I'll give an example for you as the last point here. There's a great book called The Information, which you can check. It's the history of information theory. And they talk about how when they introduced telephones, it enabled the building of skyscrapers, which is like very non-obvious, right? You can think like, hang on, what are you talking about here? Why would that enable the building of skyscrapers? And the answer is that prior to telephones, what had to happen was you had to have people physically delivering messages in and out of these buildings. So if you have a floor, to deliver the amount of information that you want in and out the door, there's a certain volume of people, okay? Well, if you have to put those people, funnel them all into an elevator, there's just a very, very high demand. You can't go very many floors up because you get bottlenecked by this elevator. But the moment that you had telephones meant you didn't need to be sending these physical messengers up and down so much, and that enabled them to build these taller buildings. That, I think, is like this really, really interesting way of thinking of the kind of non-obvious orthogonal benefits of AI that probably are going to breed some really, really great opportunities worth investing in that people are not talking about today. And so if you have some of those, by all means, let me know. Definitely go and join our community and stuff like that. I would love to hear about those. Put them in the comments below. But otherwise, I'd love to hear your comments on the space in general. It's obviously a really exciting and interesting place to invest these days. But I'm always looking for sort of asymmetric bets that I think are high probability, high return, lower risk, and none of these, in terms of the frontier model level, make sense to me at this stage. So love to hear it. Look forward to talking to you guys on the next video.